All right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, good to see you guys. Anybody make it to the concert Friday night? Any hands? What'd you think? You guys enjoy it? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we went as a fam too, and it was. Oh, you did? Cool, nice. Yeah, yeah. All of our kids didn't we didn't have any meltdowns or anything. It was a late night for everybody, but it was super fun. Yeah, if you guys aren't familiar with some of John Foreman's stuff from Switchfoot and later, yeah, just some of the most incredible lyrics and yeah, felt like a worship service at certain points, but yeah, just a super great show. So yeah, definitely check out some of his music. I was thinking maybe I would play one in here right now, but I didn't really get my act together quick enough. But maybe I'll start out on Wednesday with a song. I think my wife would probably play one for you guys if you're in her class after this one. But yeah, so maybe we'll do that on Wednesday. But yeah, so just reminders for what's going on this week. We got the big lab quiz, so the 16-pointer. Okay, so that's all those abdominal arteries in the cat, the organs, just identifying the organs. Okay, and then yeah, and then a little bit of review stuff on the heart, those coronary vessels again, and then those human arteries of the head, the circle of Willis, and the ones going up into the neck. That's all in towards the very end of the lab handout there. Tells you which ones you need to know. So make sure you're studying those. The head and neck ones directly from the textbook. That's the best place to study those. They'll be diagram-like pictures. They won't be like pictures of a cadaver. They'll be drawn type pictures. Okay, so that'll be that. And then yeah, today is the last day of material for exam 3 we have on Friday, and then Wednesday we'll start the stuff for exam 4. So that's the deal. Any questions about what's going on this week? Okay, how you guys feeling? Ready for exam 3? Ready for spring break? Yeah. I agree. I'm ready for spring break too. Yeah, Danica? Sorry, I couldn't quite hear Danica's question. Say it again. Yes, this is a printed one, just like the last one. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. All right. Well, today we're continuing on with the cardiovascular system and moving away from the cardio side of that to the vascular side of that. Okay. So the blood vessels is really what the vascular system is. Okay. How many of you have been to one of these type exhibits, like the bodies exhibit or anything like that? Yeah, a couple of you guys have. Most of them, they have full humans that are just blood vessels like this, which is pretty remarkable. I have no idea how they can do that, but it's incredible. And that's what the back of this. That's what the back of these slides are. Is one of those images where it's just all blood vessels. Yeah. So. Yeah, so let's start out with this question here in regards to how much blood vessels we have, how many we have, what the length of our total vascular system is. Yeah, take a guess. All right, anybody else? Got 50 of you so far. Just take a guess if you're not sure. Probably not sure, obviously. All right, anybody else? Is that everybody? Got 58, I think. Okay, all right, so we're kind of distributed out as I would expect, because you wouldn't know the answer to this, but it's this one. It is. And so that would, it's only about 25,000 miles to go around the world. The circumference of the earth is 25,000 miles. Okay, so inside each of us is enough blood vessels to go around the world 2.5 times. Right, and that's it. And so when I think about this, I just, not just this, but I think about like the fact that our body can control like where the blood is within that 60,000 miles. And when something like a single neuron inside of our brain starts doing more metabolism, it gets more blood by opening up some blood vessels that go towards it, right? This level of control just makes me think of this beautiful verse that is a favorite of anatomy professors, but it's a good one, right? Psalm 139, for you created me in my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. So the vascular system is one of many places where I feel like this level of intricacy, this level of detail is just so evident. So yeah, so let's talk about those blood vessels. Today we'll talk about mostly anatomy with the blood vessels, okay? So the different types, different categories, and then we'll spend time on Wednesday getting into what they do as far as the physiology goes. And so, yeah, so we got three primary types: arteries, capillaries, and veins, okay? So arteries are always going away from the heart. Capillaries are really where the business of the vascular system happens, which is where all the diffusion happens, okay? So we can't pull oxygen out of a vein. We can't pull oxygen out of an artery. It has to be in a capillary and able to be able to do that, okay? And then veins are going towards the heart. And this is the order typically, right? Artery to capillary, capillary to vein, and then vein back to the heart, okay? But then we've got this other type of category of blood vessel called an anastomosis. Okay, plural will be anastomoses. And this is where two blood vessel types merge together. And so we got a few different types. So one's called an arterial anastomosis. This is exactly what you're studying this week for the lab quiz, in that idea of the circle of Willis. Okay, so really it's an artery comes up, and instead of going to a capillary bed, it hits another artery instead. Right? And then that one might merge into another artery, just like in the circle of Willis. It creates this circle of arteries that never get to capillary beds first. And the reason for that is if one side gets blocked, normally we wouldn't be able to get any oxygen to anything beyond that. But since that side's blocked, the other side of the circle of Willis can still provide some blood flow all the way to the back of that blockage, right? And so this is a protective mechanism. Okay, and then we have arteriovenous anastomoses, which that's just like skipping a capillary bed, right? So we don't have the capillary bed in the middle. It's just artery right to vein. Okay, and so we have these in all of our capillary beds actually. If the capillary beds are closed, then we just shunt blood right from artery to vein, and this is a way to kind of be efficient. If the tissue around that capillary bed isn't really needing a lot of oxygen at that time point, then we don't send blood into those capillaries. We just kind of skip it and it goes over to the venous system. This is known as a shunt. Okay, and then the venous one, this is just where a vein connects to another vein instead of going back to the heart. And this happens a lot on the venous side. Actually, the venous side is much less organized, and there's a lot more variation in our veins than there are in our arteries. And so we see lots of venous anastomoses. Okay, if you've got that written down, feel free to flip to the next page and you can start labeling those different categories there. And there is a clicker question there too that you can work on. Everybody's got it. Okay. Go ahead. So work on that with people on your team and send in that one when you can.
For arterial, you said it skips a capillary bed?
Arterial is the one. No, that's what, yeah, I mean, they all kind of technically don't, but that's just artery to artery. So instead of going artery to capillary to vein,
Artery instead of artery vein, because this is that one.
arteriovenous is truly the skipping of the capillary bed. Arterial is more just like connecting artery to artery to, if there's a blockage, then it can kind of come around the back way. And then,
Could it have a capillary bed that it goes into?
it'll all still eventually get to capillary beds, like off of the kind of offshoots, like if this is the one there, right? So all these little ones will lead to capillary beds, but it's just not so normal to have artery go up to another artery, go up to another artery.
Okay, but this is literally directly artery to artery. That's what makes it different.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so you're sending that in there. All right, so a few more of you, go ahead and send it in. Give you about 10 more seconds. How many of you guys went to the basketball game? I know I saw a few of you guys there, basketball games. Yeah, a few of you guys. Yeah, I saw I think you were out there playing knockout, weren't you? Yeah, yeah. Oh, you were out there. I didn't know if I missed you. I saw you standing out there. Yeah. Yeah, it was the men's game was definitely fun. The women's had a harder time, but yeah, it was fun. We had the kids there too. Definitely a good time. Were some of you guys following the whole Bachelorette thing when the alum was in it? Yeah, so yeah, he was on our basketball team and stuff a while back, and yeah, so that was kind of funny to see him give the rose to that. I think it was a nursing student that got it, wasn't it? Some of you guys know her. Not him, but during the game he gave a student a rose. I don't know if you saw that part, but yeah, I think that was a nursing student. But yeah. Anyways, all right. Okay. All right. So let's see what you guys said. All right. About 2/3 of you said C right here. So what do we call that? Arterial anastomosis. There we go. Arterial anastomosis. So that's C. Okay. This is exactly what you guys are studying this week, right? That is the circle of Willis. Okay. All right. So then which one is artery? Which letter? E. Okay. Vein. A. All right. Capillary. Yeah. So some are saying E, some are saying F. So it will be F. That's actually the capillary bed. Okay. We already got C, venous anastomosis. Which one would that be? Yeah, D over there. And this is kind of how the venous system works. We just kind of have a lot of things connecting to each other like that. It's a little bit, like I said, more disorganized. And then E there is the last one. So the arterial venous shunt, right? So the blood can just skip the capillary bed by going straight through. And you can see there's these little bands of smooth muscle here. Those are little sphincters, right? And so when those open, that lets the blood go into the capillaries and lets diffusion happen. When they're shut, then it just goes through that shunt instead, and not much oxygenated blood gets through. Okay, so those are all of our vessel categories. Questions on any of those? Okay. All right, so then the different layers of the blood vessel walls. The most external, we have the tunica externa, also known as the adventitia of a blood vessel. So this is the most outer, the most protective, kind of the thicker, stronger part, similar to the most external layer in our eye, right? That fibrous layer, so connective tissue. And then the tunica media, just like in a lot of the structures we've looked at, the middle layer is muscle, right? We have this, yeah, in the uterus, we saw the same thing. Many other structures are the same way. The digestive tract will be the same way when we get there. That middle layer tends to be the muscular layer, right? And so this is smooth muscle that's circularly arranged. So it's going circularly around the arteries. We'll see in the digestive tract, we have some going in a circular pattern, but then others going longitudinally down the tube. In blood vessels, we just have the circular type of muscle here. Okay, so when this muscle contracts, that leads to vasoconstriction and it squeezes down, right? So when circular muscles contract, they squeeze down and pinch down on the artery, right? And this would decrease blood flow to the area beyond where that constriction happened, right? And when that muscle relaxes, it vasodilates and increases flow right beyond that area. We'll talk more about those dynamics next time. Okay, and then the most internal layer, tunica intima, This is nice and smooth. It's a one continuous layer through all of that 60,000 miles of blood vessels. It's the same continuous layer, right? And these are known as endothelial cells, right? We've talked about these a little bit already. We talked about them in terms of erectile dysfunction and the release of nitric oxide, nitric oxide. And we also talked about nitric oxide in terms of when somebody has angina, that chest pain that they can have. They take some nitroglycerin, right, which is just a synthetic version of nitric oxide, and that makes your blood vessels dilate. It's the same stuff that these endothelial cells make, is nitric oxide. And so one of their big roles they play is, so the clinical application of this is when somebody has endothelial dysfunction, meaning that those endothelial cells aren't so good at making and releasing nitric oxide anymore. And that's where the first step in the progression of atherosclerosis, which is the first step towards having a heart attack, right? So the number one thing that kills us in the US, really the root cause of that is the dysfunction of this layer in your blood vessels. Okay. All right, questions about those? All right, so go ahead on the next slide and you can just briefly label these layers here, and then you can answer this question here.
No. I just I'm reading upside down.
Okay, so you're just labeling those layers and just send in your answer to that question on the top there. Which layer is the only layer that capillaries have? Back. All right, got about 10 seconds. Go ahead and send in the answer there on your clickers. All right. Okay, so about 60% of you said A there. Okay, so A is that most internal layer. So that's the tunica intima. That's where we see the endothelium or the endothelial cells. Okay, and then B is that middle layer. So that's where the tunica media, where we see the smooth muscle. And then C is the tunica externa, where we see that connective tissue there. Okay, so we can see it on arteries, on veins, and then capillaries look very different, right? Most of you are saying A is the one that capillaries have, which is true. So capillaries don't have smooth muscle. They don't have the tunica externa. They just have that endothelial cell layer, and that's it. Okay. So if the whole point of capillaries is to allow things to go out of the blood and into the tissue around it, or out of that tissue back into the blood, then they need to be just a very thin layer. Those cells are flat and thin, so we can diffuse things right through them very easily. Okay. And then anybody have any idea what D is? It's a valve. Yeah. Veins have valves in them. We'll talk about why in a sec when we get there, but that's a valve. We don't see those in capillaries or arteries, but we do see them in veins. Okay. All right. So just just kind of an overview of where we find all of our blood, right? If we're just right now, as you guys are sitting there at rest, if we looked at your total blood volume, put it in a pie chart, it would look something like this. Okay. So as you can see, over half of our blood is kind of just sitting out in all of those veins that we have. Right. And this is one reason, like when you go on long flights, they recommend that you kind of like are kind of stand up and do some like heel raises or contract your quads, squeeze your glutes a little bit, kind of keep the blood moving, because once the blood gets over to the venous side, there's really no pressure over there. So one of the big things we rely on to move blood in our veins is contraction of muscle. It's called the muscle pump system. We smash down our veins when we do that, and it keeps blood moving. But if you're just sitting there still for a long time, it can pool, which can lead to blood clotting at sometimes. It can also kind of stretch out your veins, lead to varicose veins. We'll talk about those. But this one of the functions of the venous side of the vascular system is to be like a reservoir for blood. And so when we start exercising, we squeeze down those veins and send a lot of this 55% of the blood back into general circulation, so we can increase our cardiac output, like we talked about last time. So yeah, so that's that. So we'll talk about each of the kind of portions of the vascular system now. So start with the arterial side. These are smaller as they go away from the heart, right? As all are, but the direction of blood flow is actually obviously going from the heart out. So the biggest one in our body is our aorta, right? And then it splits down into smaller arteries from there, all the way down to the tiniest arteries called arterioles. Okay. Overall in arteries, the media layer is the thickest one. So there's lots of smooth muscle typically in arteries. Okay, this is supporting the vessels against high blood pressure. Okay, because there's a lot more blood pressure on the arterial side than there is on the venous side. This is why when somebody has an arterial bleed, I've seen this in movies and other places, that when an artery is cut open, blood can literally kind of squirt out of that artery, out of their body, because there's so much pressure. Every time your heart beats, there's a lot of pressure that's pushing that blood through the artery. In a vein, that doesn't happen. It just kind of oozes out from the vein. But in arteries, it literally will kind of squirt out because of that high pressure. Okay, so that middle layer helps to protect against that, but then also the smooth muscle can contract and relax and change the size of those arteries to help regulate our blood pressure. Okay, so that layer is both elastic and contractile. Right. So what happens when our heart contracts is the arteries stretch out, right? Because they undergo that pressure from the heart. So that stretches our arteries, and then it bounces back right behind it. And that's actually a really important part of keeping blood pressure up in your body, is that stretch and then that bounce back. Because when that happens, that actually pushes the blood along when it bounces back, right? So the artery stretches under the contraction of the heart, and then it snaps back elastically and kind of pushes the blood from behind and keeps it going, right? And so that actually helps us maintain our blood pressure as the blood travels through the arterial side. Our blood pressure is primarily controlled by our sympathetic nervous system. Okay, if we overall have an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, this constricts all of our arteries all around the body, which increases our blood pressure. Okay. So that's going to increase blood pressure. If the sympathetic nervous system activity drops, then we dilate, and that's going to decrease our blood pressure. Okay, so the big artery types that we have, the large ones are called either elastic arteries or conducting arteries. Okay, so they have a very large lumen, which means the inside where the blood travels. Okay, this means they can get a lot of blood somewhere rapidly. Okay, so that's exactly what I just said. So get a lot of blood somewhere fast. Okay, so the examples of these would be like our aorta, and then those big branches that come off of the aorta that you guys are having to know in the heart right now. Okay, pulmonary trunk is the same way. Okay, so when it comes to those layers, you can kind of see the how each of those layers look in this type of artery. Okay, kind of a thin externa, very thick media. This is because we've got again very high pressure in these arteries, so it needs to be strong so we don't break those arteries with that high pressure. But then we also need to be able to constrict and dilate some of those large arteries. Okay, again, the intima needs to be pretty thick to support the artery as well. Okay, so those are the big ones, and then we keep working our way down. Those are the elastic arteries. Give you guys one more sec. See some of you still writing. Yeah, so then after we get from the elastic arteries, we move into what's called the muscular arteries, also known as distributing arteries. Okay, this is they're kind of the middle size of arteries. Function of these is to kind of like it sounds, distribute blood to various areas throughout the body. Okay. And the examples of these are most of the named ones that we learned in lab, except for the big ones that come right off of the aorta. Okay, but beyond that, those are pretty much all examples of muscular arteries. Okay, and then finally we get down to the smallest ones called arterioles. These have the smallest lumen. The function of these is really to regulate blood flow to capillaries. Okay, when it comes to regulating our blood pressure, changing size of our arterioles has the greatest effect of all. Okay, so this is where most of our blood pressure regulation occurs. Okay, the reason for this is because there's so many of them, right? So that means there's a lot of blood in these at any given time. So if we just constrict all of these arterioles at once, our blood pressure goes up. If we dilate all these at the same time, our blood pressure goes down. Okay, so that's a key function of these, is this is the primary site for blood pressure control. Okay. All right, so we can just kind of walk through this one together. We can see the arteries leaving the heart here. All right, so the big ones we start out with, those elastic or conducting arteries. Okay, those are going to go down and split off into multiple muscular arteries or distributing arteries. Okay, and then those distributing arteries are going to split off into a bunch of little arterioles, and those are known as the resistance vessels. Right, so blood flow is going to meet a lot of resistance when it hits these because they're so much smaller. And then that idea of resistance is kind of giving us the clue that this is the place where most of our blood pressure regulation happens. Okay, so that letter was C there. So that is the site of the most blood flow control, is those resistance vessels. Okay, and then we can see D there. We actually see, yeah, so similar to what we already saw, this is a different name for what we already looked at. This is our arteriovenous anastomosis. It's also just known as a meta-arteriole. Okay, so we can see the artery going down to the capillary bed. Again, it can skip that by going through that shunt instead, or also known as a meta-arteriole, also known as an arteriovenous anastomosis. Okay. Questions on any of that? All right, so then let's go to the next one in the chain of events here, which would be the capillaries. Okay, so we go from those arteries now to capillaries. Okay, so we're going to find these between venules, which we haven't talked about yet, and arterioles. We just talked about the arterioles. So the arterioles will lead right to capillary beds, like I just showed on the last slide. Okay, so the function of capillaries is this is where all exchange happens, right? So anything that we're trying to drop off out of the blood to the tissues comes out here, but then there's waste products that need to get pulled out of the tissues and brought back into the blood. And so that happens here as well. Okay, so the structure, like we already talked about, this is the endothelial layer only. Right, so just that single cell layer. And when it comes to those 60,000 miles of blood vessels, 99% of them are capillaries, right? Because these are microscopic. They're very, very small. And we have capillaries everywhere in our body, and we can't even see them because they're so small. Right? But if we lined up each and every single one of those in a single file line, that's how we get the 60,000 miles. Right? Okay, so when it comes to the capillary beds themselves, we just talked about those meta-arterioles. Okay, this is what skips capillary beds. This is an arteriovenous anastomosis. Okay, the true capillary part is somewhere between 10 and 20 little tiny blood vessels. And they're so small that actually a single red blood cell only fits in there at a time. Right, so it's like a single file line of red blood cells making their way through those little capillaries. And that makes sense, right? Because if we want to diffuse things into and out of the red blood cells, then we want the capillary walls touching the red blood cell. And we want it as close as possible. And that's what it is when it's going through there. Okay, so again, we have those little sphincters, those little circular muscles that allow blood to go into the capillaries or not. All right, so when we open up our capillary bed, we do that by relaxing those pre-capillary sphincters. That allows blood into the capillary bed for exchange to happen, but we can also close them, and then the blood will go back through that shunt instead and skip the capillary bed. Okay, so there's kind of three primary types of capillaries, and those are listed here. So we have the continuous type, which again is those endothelial cells make a continuous wall. So the cells are right up next to each other. They're close to each other. There's no space between the cells. So anything that's going to diffuse through out of the capillary into the tissue or vice versa has to go through the cell. Okay, so we have a lot of control over what gets through there. All right, so we have these in our brain, central nervous system. They make up our blood-brain barrier. We have these in our skin. We have these in our muscle. Okay, the function of these is to, yes, allow for diffusion, but also create a strong seal. So we can control what comes into the into and out of those capillary beds. Okay, then we also have what's called fenestrated capillary beds. These ones, the endothelial cells actually have holes in them. Okay, so they have full-on holes in them that allow things to pass through. All right, so this allows for some diffusion or more diffusion, and then permeability, greater amounts of permeability for larger substances just pass right through those pores. Okay, so we find these in places where in organs that do a lot of active absorption of things and filtration of our blood. And so our kidneys are big time responsible for filtering our blood. So we find these fenestrated capillaries there. Endocrine glands are very important to release hormones and then let those hormones get into the blood. Many of those hormones are too big to just diffuse through. So they need special little holes in the capillaries next to those organs. And that's how we can do that. And then in our intestines, we need to be able to absorb nutrients. And some of those nutrients are a little bit larger than the very small molecules. So they need to be able to pass through these little pores as well. Okay, and then finally we got the most extreme on the other side, which is the sinusoidal capillaries, which these have holes in the cells, but they also have gaps between the cells too. Okay, so very high permeability. This is what allows full proteins and full cells to actually pass out of the vascular system and into the tissues. Okay, the reason we would do this would be in organs that actually help us create our blood and modify our blood cells. Okay, so bone marrow is where almost all of our blood cells are made, right? So when the bone marrow makes those blood cells, it's going to release those into the space around them. And then those cells have to make their way into the vascular system. So they can do that through these big holes. Same thing with our liver. Our liver is responsible for dealing with our old red blood cells when they're not working properly anymore. And so those have to be able to make it through those holes. Same with our spleen is partially responsible for building up our immune cells. So we find those there. Okay, so take a second and just label these three types of capillaries we just talked about and answer that question there on your clickers. All right, about 10 or 15 seconds. Go ahead and send in your answer if you haven't yet. All right, so that's everybody. Yeah, so about 2/3 of you are saying B, the continuous ones there. Okay, so that's correct. Definitely the continuous ones are our most common type of capillaries. The other ones are kind of more specialized that we find in special places. Okay, so what's A called? Yeah, so that's our sinusoidal, B's are continuous, and C is those fenestrated. Okay, any questions on those capillary types? Okay. All right. And so this is just kind of an illustration that shows either an open versus a closed capillary bed. Okay. Again, we can see that shunt that could go through, but if we open these up, then blood's able to get in both ways. When they're closed, the blood just skips right through, like we talked about. Yeah, go ahead, Hannah. So it's just kind of an efficiency thing. We have so many capillary beds throughout our body. If we opened them all up at the same time, we would actually collapse because our blood pressure would drop so rapidly, which is exactly what happens in anaphylactic shock, right? So we just don't have enough blood pressure to maintain flow through all of our capillary beds at any given time. And so there's just, certain parts of the body that are very active that need a lot of blood flow at certain times, and then other parts that are pretty dormant and it doesn't really need much blood flow. So it can regulate based on that. Yeah, good question. Yeah, Ashton? Yeah, in this one, the middle is the shunt. One of the images back, it looked like the meta-arterial was going up around, and it can happen either way, but yeah. Good question. Other questions on that? Go ahead.
Collapse because all the blood's going into the capillary and there's not enough around, I guess.
Yeah, so that's part of it, is that we're sending so much blood into these small vessels, and there's just so many of them that it's kind of like, just having, the way I always think about it was like a plumbing system in a house where like you have a certain amount of water in the pipes, and then if all of a sudden we just like double the amount of pipes but keep that same amount of water, then our pressure is going to be very low in that system, right? And so then we don't have enough pressure to get blood to our heads and our brain, and so the brain's idea to fix that is to get you horizontal, right? So, right, that's the best way. If it doesn't have to fight gravity anymore, then you have much better chance of getting blood to your brain. So collapse, right? Yeah. Yeah. Other questions on that? Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about the last portion of the vascular system, which would be the veins. Okay. So these ones increase in size as they move towards the heart. Okay. And so blood is going obviously from the capillary beds right to the venous system and then all the way back towards the heart. Okay. So the function of these is obviously just bringing blood back to the heart. Okay. Also, like I said, if 55% of our blood is kind of just hanging out in our veins, then that's one of their big functions, is to allow for blood pooling, which can kind of serve as this reservoir for blood. And then when we start exercising, we can mobilize that blood pool, bring it back to the general circulation. And that's a big part of what increases our preload, right? Remember we talked about those things last time, preload, afterload, contractility. In order to increase our stroke volume, we got to get more blood back to the heart. We have to increase venous return. And so one way to do that is to clamp down on all those veins that are holding 55% of our blood and send it back into circulation. So that's what we see here. Okay. And so, like I said before, veins really rely on this thing called the muscle pump, which this is a kind of an exaggerated version of what that looks like. Obviously, veins aren't that big in your calf, but this is kind of the setup, is we have veins all over our body that are either kind of within muscles, or they're between a muscle and another muscle, or between a muscle and a bone, or between muscle and skin. And so when we smash down those muscles, it smashes down veins too. So it creates pressure, because there's really no pressure over in the venous side, because when blood gets through those capillaries are so small that we've lost all of our pressure by the time we get there. So once it gets to the venous side, we have to rely on other things to get our blood back. Okay. So, and the reason the blood only goes one direction is because of the valves. Okay, so you can see the blood, see these little valves here, right? And so when we squeeze down and contract, it pushes blood in one direction. and allows it to go up. And once it gets past a single valve, it kind of like notches its way up. Right now it's past that valve. Next time you squeeze your muscle down, it's going to try to push blood both ways, but it's going to hit a valve one way and then hit an open valve the other way and just kind of keep notching forward and like incrementally until it makes its way back to the heart. Okay, questions on that? Yeah, Trevor?
Wouldn't it be more advantageous to have like a pool of blood that's already oxygenated? So why do we have it pooled in the vein?
Yeah, it's a good question. Part of the deal is oxygenated blood pretty much always needs to be moving because it doesn't oxygen. If blood is around around cells, it's gonna diffuse out, and so it's but even in the veins, you can't really diffuse things out of veins, but there is kind of a certain amount of time that oxygen is going to stay on that hemoglobin no matter what, and so even within your blood, if the red blood cells sit in there and there's not. If it's in kind of a vein, then there's not going to be much oxygen around the red blood cell. So the oxygen would then diffuse out of the cell. So, I mean, that's part of it. But yeah, I definitely see what you're saying. It would be nice to have a fully oxygenated blood pool. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure why that's not set up, but there's just a couple ideas. But yeah, that's a good question. Other questions on that? Yeah, Ashley. So the blood is actually going up this way. Yeah, so like from the foot, like up. It looks like it's trying to go down this way on that one, because that's like that's just because gravity does that, right? Gravity will make it fall back down. It's just showing that it tries to fall back down, but it hits that valve and the valve doesn't let it. That's kind of why that arrow is going in that direction. That makes sense? Yeah. Other questions on that? Okay. So part of the research I do is actually looking at the vascular system with an ultrasound machine. Okay. And so this is an image, a little video from that ultrasound machine. And what we typically do is we look at the brachial artery, which is right here. Okay. We put this little Doppler thing on the inside that picks up on the movement of blood flow. And each of these little waves is the heart beating, and that Doppler is picking up on that. But every once in a while, we get a good view of the brachial vein too, which is right underneath the brachial artery. And that's right here. And so I'm going to play this little video, and every once in a while you can actually see the valve really clearly. And in this case you could, so I just snapped a little screenshot of it just to be able to show when I talk about valves in veins, and you'll see the little leaflets of the valve kind of opening and closing. Right where that little circle is. See that little thing flapping around? Yeah, so, and you can see exactly that every time the heart beats, actually the arteries stretch a little bit. And that stretch of the artery actually smashes down the vein a little bit next to it and allows blood to push through. So that was just a random time where we could actually really clearly make out that valve where normally we can't. So yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the vein structures here. So the layers are much thinner than the arteries. All the layers are. Okay. But the thickest layer in veins is that most external layer, that tunica externa. Okay, this gives support via collagen fibers, so connective tissue. Okay, the tunica intima, again, is that endothelial layer, but it's actually the endothelial cells themselves that form into valves too. Okay, so it's just like another little extra layer of endothelial cells that make the valves. We have more valves in the limb veins where we have to fight against gravity more often, right? Down in our legs and our arms. Okay, and then the smallest ones that are right on the other side of the capillary beds are the venules, right? So it goes arterial, capillary, venule in the order there. And then we have these specialized veins that can completely flatten out called venous sinuses. We have some of these in our brain as well as in our heart, very thin walls. Okay, one common pathology is varicose veins. The problem with varicose veins is the valves aren't working. And so blood just pools out in the veins so much that it actually just starts to stretch out those vessels. And if you've ever studied a little bit about geography, then you know that with you can tell that a river is older than another river by how much it meanders, right? So the meandering of a river is like how much it curves back and forth, right? Because the longer a river is around, the more it does that. It just always reminds me of that of varicose veins. The more pressure we put on them, the more stretched out they get, and then the more they do that same kind of meandering type thing. And these can be pretty painful. There's definitely a strong genetic component to varicose veins. But other things can cause that as well: prolonged positions, pregnancy, obesity. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any treatment options?
Yeah, there definitely are some surgical options when they get bad enough that they can go in and kind of remove part of them and then reconnect the other parts, right? Because there's just like way too much vein right there, right? So you could see how they could kind of cut out parts of it and then reconnect those to straighten them out. But yeah, I'm not sure how successful the surgeries are. I don't know a lot about it. Yeah. Yeah, Olivia? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same idea we were talking about before with the blood pooling. Like if you're like sitting, desk job type thing, you're just sitting in one position for a long time without moving, that's a risk factor for sure. So being able to just get up and move every once in a while, having a standing desk, but even that, if you're standing in one position, you still got to move too, right? So just taking little 5-minute breaks every hour, things like that, where you at least just get up and walk around a little bit is definitely a helpful thing for this. So, yeah. Go ahead, Kat. It's a good question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, it almost makes sense, but I wouldn't necessarily think that would increase their blood volume, but they might, maybe they just have more out in their veins, but I'm not really sure. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I think it's just like actual like pain receptors you have in your veins, and when those vessels are just literally being stretched by the extra pressure, and so I think that's just leading to some pain there. That's my understanding. Yeah. Sorry. Definitely, yeah. You definitely have a higher risk for clotting the more blood that's pooled in those areas. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's because they're more superficial typically. Yeah. So veins are always more superficial and arteries are deeper. So yeah, that's why. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's do a quick recap here of the different vessel types that we talked about. Okay, so go ahead and you can just label these different, kind of discuss the function of each of these types, and then just kind of discuss these questions here. And then finally on your clickers, send in the type that controls blood pressure the most. Okay, go ahead.
Like the bit in the beginning, so we're talking about like what's on the list, so what varies of the abdomen and what they supply for the cat.
If
Like
it
what they
says that in
supply?
the artery, I mean, if it says that in the packet, then you have to know what it
Okay,
supplies.
and then human arteries of neck and head, so like brain up here.
Yeah,
We also need to know,
there's some on those blood vessels of the heart again too, the
we need to
coronary
know the
vessels.
human like abdominal arteries and veins too for this case, or is it just
The cat ones,
head and neck?
just the head and neck for human, and then the.
Actually, ask you about the order class, because so I can show you like the packet.
Yeah, sure.
You're right.
All right, so you're sending that answer in on your clickers there. Where does the most blood pressure control occur? All right. It's like just about everybody. So pretty much everybody is saying C there for where does the most blood pressure control occur. So that's those arterioles. Okay. You can just, this is the same. You don't necessarily have to jot all of this down. That's the same functions that I had on the previous slide. So don't, you guys just have to. I know you have to. I shouldn't even have uncovered them, but so yeah. So that, and then where does diffusion occur? Which ones? Yeah, they're actually not on there, right? Of those four, but that would obviously be the capillaries. Okay, and then most of blood found at any given point. Where was that one? Veins, all right? Okay, and then which are the most abundant? If definitely capillaries, but again, that wasn't on there. But then it would be the two smaller ones, right? The arterioles and the venules. If you didn't have capillaries as a choice, it would be those next two smallest ones there. Okay, and while you guys are writing that down, we got a little time for a John Foreman song before we're done. So I'm gonna play one. All right, you guys ready? So this is one he played. This is one he played when we were at the concert, and it's just a beautiful song about what kind of legacy that you want to leave, and so I'll leave you guys with this.